At Lyft Economy, we thought long and hard about including ads on the show, and we decided to only work with high-impact companies that align with our values. Therefore, our first sponsor is Clearinghouse CDFI. Clearinghouse CDFI addresses unmet credit needs in California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and sovereign nations in the western United States. For 22 years, Clearinghouse CDFI has helped bridge the gap between conventional lending standards and the needs of low-income and distressed communities. Clearinghouse CDFI is also a B Corp, a certification received from the nonprofit B Lab. B Corps are companies who meet rigorous standards of social and environmental performance, transparency, and accountability, and use business as a force for good. More information is available at www.ccdfi.com. Once again, that is www.ccdfi.com. At the end of today's episode, stay tuned for a 5-minute mini interview with Doug Bistry, CEO of Clearinghouse CDFI. Welcome to Next Economy Now. I'm your host, Andrew Baskin. The goal of this interview series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, diverse, transparent, and whole systems approach to using business as a force for good.
My guest today is Rinku Sen, an author, activist, and strategist. Rinku is a former executive director of Race Forward and publisher of Colorlines.com, and she now writes and curates the news at rinkusen.com. Rinku's also the author of 2 books, Stir It Up and The Accidental American. Rinku, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Really happy to join you.
Great. My first question is, let's start with a bit about your background and how you first got interested in the work that you're doing today. How did that evolution happen for you?
Well, the origin story of my life as an activist starts really in my second year of college. I was an immigrant kid. My family came to the States in 1972 when I was 5 and a half. And my father was a metallurgical engineer who worked in aluminum factories initially. So my growing up was in suburbs, post-war suburban developments that were initially created for returning soldiers after World War II, and that were the site of enormous racial conflict because Black people were banned from moving into those suburbs, and Black veterans, GIs, were often blocked from being able to access the GI Bill and its benefits. But by the early 70s, some immigrant families, Asian immigrant families like mine, were able to move in, and those were the communities I grew up in, white communities that had been kept deliberately white until at least the mid-70s. So while I was growing up as one of very few brown-skinned children, I really didn't deal with race very explicitly. It was always present. It's in the back of my mind. Things would happen. I would wonder, but there was no structure through which to explore those things. And so that didn't really happen for me until I went to college. And in my second year, at the very beginning, there was a racial justice campaign that started on campus. There had been an incident of racial violence, and the Black Student Organization on our campus had begun a whole campaign from that incident, both for justice on that specific thing, but also for a much larger set of changes, a new Third World Center, new curricula, new teachers, needs-blind admissions was something that we fought for. And I got involved in that campaign, and we won. So my first experience of organizing, which is not everyone's, was of getting together with my peers and figuring out what the problems were, locating the source of those problems in institutional action, and then making demands on the institution to change them. And we won. And some of the things we won are still on that campus today, 35 years later. So I pretty much didn't look back after that. It was organizing and racial justice, combined really closely with feminism and economic justice. And since I was 17 years old, I've never been not busy because there's always a ton to do if those are your abiding concerns in life.
And so so post-college, is that when so talk a little bit about like, what did you start to do once you got into the professional side? Like what did you?
So when I was graduating from college, my options were to become an attorney, which a lot of people were doing, or to go into politics, or, electoral work, to become an English professor, or to go into organizing. And I decided to take an organizing job after I got out of school. And for 12 years, I worked at a training center called the Center for Third World Organizing. And during those 12 years, I trained tons of organizers of color, most of them young, but not exclusively. And I worked on campaigns all around the country. The way that organization worked is that we had a summer program, we'd place interns with campaigns, and the staff would go and work on those campaigns also with the interns. So in my 20s, I got to work on Justice for Janitors campaigns, which were some of the very earliest campaigns where in the service industry, where the new people of the service industry, which at that time was immigrant janitors, were being organized not through the traditional hold an election in a workplace way, but through what was then a new model of card check recognition, where the union would go and get workers to say, yes, we want to join the union. They'd sign a card, and they'd pressure the employer to just recognize the union rather than going through the election process. And so our interns were some of the earliest staff on those Justice for Janitors campaigns, and eventually hired by those unions to keep that going. I worked on housing campaigns and healthcare campaigns and welfare rights campaigns all through my 20s. So that experience taught me how to run campaigns, obviously, small ones, big ones. It taught me that often you don't win everything you're going out for, and just, the realities of doing that work. And it also what we did there at the Center for Third World Organizing was do community organizing with a very explicit racial justice lens. And that helped us really build a new model of community organizing that was somewhat different from Saul Alinsky's model. And I'm happy to talk about that more during our time together if it comes up. But I ended up writing up that new model in my first book, Stir It Up, which is a primer on organizing. So that was what I did. I trained people even as I was learning myself. And I, with my colleagues, really crafted or more codified, because there's nothing really new in this world ever. Anything we think to do now, the only thing new about it is that we might be using new technology, but probably someone in history has tried to organize in whatever way we're thinking about now. But I codified how contemporary organizers of the late 80s and the 90s were thinking about ideology. Organizers of color were thinking about ideology, the role of the organizer and the role of community leaders, and how you make multiracial organizations that are for real, where race is not suppressed or ignored, but dealt with toward the purpose of building a stronger community and organization.
And was that the sort of impetus that led you into Race Forward and that work? Yeah.
So I have a weird
We're doing like a full bio.
Yeah, I have a strange career trajectory because I've really only had 2 jobs in my adult life, and the same person gave them both to me. So Gary Delgado is the founder of the Center for Third World Organizing and of the Applied Research Center, which is what Race Forward used to be called. And I took over the Center for Third World Organizing from him in 1990. And in 2001, after I left that organization myself, I moved over to the Applied Research Center, worked as communications director, and then became president there. And the big shift between my late 80s and 90s and then this century of my work is that toward the end of my time as an organizer, I start to become really interested in communication and media, because I don't come from the school of organizing that says that whatever people want to do right now in whatever state they're in is what organizers are supposed to help them do. I have actual ideas, and I have a way of looking at the world. I have a worldview, and I have ideological biases, and to hide them in any organization I was working in just feels dishonest to me. So I wanted to start thinking about how we communicate our ideas to Americans without having to knock on every single door in the United States. And I couldn't quite figure out how to do that from the organizing end. I couldn't find the right job. I didn't want to start as like a beat reporter at a newspaper, although at that time I maybe could have done that still. Today that would be pretty impossible. I couldn't even get that job if I wanted it. So I decided to go to journalism school, and I took myself off to Columbia. And while I went to journalism school, I began working at the Applied Research Center as our communications director. And when I took over the Applied Research Center, then we kind of recrafted the three things we had traditionally done, which was research, training, and strategizing with organizers who were using our research. And we were publishing Colorlines as a paper journal 4 times a year then. So we did research and we produced media and we did training, but we, from about 2007 on, we recalibrated those three things to actually lead with our media work, try to change the discourse around race in the country, which meant we did less data production and less policy writing and things like that. But that felt like the gap at the time. There were people moving policies, great policies that couldn't get traction. There was tons of data being reported and developed and researched all the time. But the conversation about race was not enabling those things to get fair hearings. So we decided that would be our role, and we'd lead with our media work and draw people into our research and training work from there. And that was really fun, and I did it for another 11 years. And that organization has now pretty much doubled in size because we did a merger, and that's all very exciting. But my life has been running 2 organizations that were both started by the same person, both working on racial justice, both trying to make more space for organizing.
Awesome. I have a question about, I love this idea of organizing around racial justice, because that's what I've been trying to do within the B Corp community and the social entrepreneurship community. And one question that's come up is around, like, how do you hold, like Bell Hooks said, the challenge is imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, which I love. Mm-hmm. And so there's sort of this debate of, like, we really want to dismantle white supremacy and look at race, and we don't want to lose track of patriarchy and, like, imperialism and just, like, capitalism itself. How do you sort of, like, and maybe the answer is just, like, try and it's intersectional, and it's just messy, but, like, how do you hold race without maybe losing the other ones in your experience?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and one that I and my colleagues have struggled with for a long time. I think it starts with imagining or understanding, kind of really integrating into your head the idea that when you add one lens to something, it doesn't mean that you've wiped out all the other lenses through which you used to look at that thing. So we all have a lens that's kind of more natural to us, and that we're used to using. My primary lens is race and gender. They come very closely together. So when I walk into any situation, or I read an article, or I observe life, I have a very immediate race lens on it and an immediate gender lens on it. I didn't really learn to put a class lens on things until I had my first job. So while I was still in college, I took a break and I went to work at the U.S. Student Association, which was an organization of people from public colleges and universities. And I had grown up middle class and then gone to a private university, Ivy League. And so my colleagues in this public university setting used to, tease me gently, like, call me private school girl, which I had never been, and things like that, and just like give me access to what their lives and their college educations and experiences had been like as working class people who had gone to college. And so, but I didn't like walk into that organization with a fully developed class analysis and lens. I had to add it. And, I didn't develop a good disability lens until I was 40, probably. But my class lens and my gender lens and my disability lens, they don't wipe out my race lens. They just enrich it. So it means that you get a more complex picture of what you're looking at, the more lenses you apply to it. And there may be conflicts, like something might appear that's great for people of color, but not so good for disabled people. Like a good example actually is this question of plastic straws and banning plastic straws. So banning plastic straws is good environmentally. Things that are good environmentally are often good racially because people of color suffer so much from environmental degradation. But the disability community has said, like, we need our plastic straws. We're not going to be able to drink. So you don't want to solve a problem and create a worse one for somebody else. We want to solve problems for everybody. So multiple lenses helps us solve problems for everybody. And the thing to just remember is one doesn't wipe out another. I want to say one more thing about this question, if it's okay. And that is that, different forms of oppression, they all have the same root. They have a root in greed often. They have a root in like dominance and the desire for dominance. They can work differently, race and gender and disability as systems, they work differently, but they have the same root. So it's okay to me to try to connect with an oppression you're not familiar with through an oppression you are familiar with. But the question is, the discipline is that you are actually trying to connect rather than deflect. So when a conversation about race begins to include other things, everybody in the room has to ask themselves, are we connecting here or are we deflecting? And course correct so that you can have your focus on race for as long as you need it, as deep as you need it. And if your focus is on gender, then same principle applies. If you're trying to solve a mostly women's problem, like sexual violence, for example, then there are all kinds of racial dimensions to that. And racial violence might help you understand sexual violence, but you got to keep talking about sexual violence. You can't like suddenly be off into racial terror for hours and days and lose what you started to focus on, unless the whole group decides together that is the correct thing to do, which you might. But decisions based on connecting versus deflecting, I think, have helped me keep focus.
That's great. That makes a lot of sense. And I think I appreciate the focus sort of like on race too, because it feels like, and maybe even like I've been experimenting with talking to other white people about white supremacy, because it's like probably the most scary thing for white people to admit is like really happening. Like they're okay with saying like, I'm down for racial justice, but then it's like, what about dismantling your own white supremacy? They're like, wait a minute, what?
Mhm.
So I guess it's like, how do you see, well, one question I have is that Bioneers video that we talked about before we started recording, you'd given I think a keynote speech or closing speech there a few years ago. And it was great. And I think it was in 2015, sort of like during Obama. And I could just feel like the room, it's like a lot of white people feeling like, yeah, she's great and amazing. But like I don't feel like people were like, whoa, this is like, and maybe they did, but it's like having Trump now feels like in a sort of a weird way, if one could call it a benefit, he sort of ripped the facade off of white people's face around like we're in a post-racial society. Have you experienced that at all, or is that just me notice? I'm kind of curious for your thoughts.
No, I think there's a huge difference talking to white progressive folks during the Obama years and now. There just is. And it's not the same kind of difference that existed between Clinton and Bush. You know what I mean? Like talking to white folks about race, not much difference between whether we have Clinton or we have Bush, but between Obama and Trump, for I think kind of obvious reasons of the contrast between their identities and between Obama's identity and Trump's racism, just to be real about it. And I think that what this election, what Trump's election did was it did embolden white supremacists so that I think many people are like, oh my God, we have like so many actively white supremacist militias and organizations and leaders and websites. And I mean, those things, most of them existed long before Trump, but they had no traction, and they certainly weren't mainstreamed, right? There weren't New York Times stories about how well groomed the Nazis were and how charming, and this alt-right business didn't exist yet. So I think that the urgency of racial justice and of naming white supremacy in particular has become really clear. But I think that it's still very confusing for most white people if they don't have consciously white supremacist thoughts like all Black people suck, or all Mexicans, all Latinos in this country are quote unquote illegal. If they don't have actively white supremacist thoughts like that, they've been pretty much thinking they were okay. And I don't know, honestly, Ryan, to tell you if it's easier now or harder to draw the continuum between institutional racism and unconscious racism and this very explicit white supremacist stuff. But I think that more people are wondering if there is one. And there is one. There are studies that start to show us what that is. There is one, but I can understand why white folks are so flummoxed right now. And a lot of the messages they get from anti-racist folks require them to make some very deep conceptual and ideological leaps. And what I always urge is action first. Like if you're trying to make an intervention with somebody, try to get them to do something rather than to agree with an idea. So for me, it's not a prerequisite that people acknowledge that they have racism somewhere in their brains before I can work with them on pretty much anything. I just don't have that litmus test, because my whole life of organizing has taught me that consciousness comes through action, that if it doesn't come through action, it comes through some other means. It's often deeply limited in terms of actually moving you toward action. So take your friend to a rally or a lecture or a movie, or, acquire pen pals together who are incarcerated. Like, try to get your white friends into actual proximity with people of color and try to get them to do things, and be there for them to talk to them about what is showing up as they're doing those things. And I think you'll make progress. Trying to front load a lot of admit this and recognize this. I just haven't found that to be that effective on pretty much any issue, including this one.
Yeah, speaking for me, I think the thing that's really been helpful around white supremacy is just acknowledging sometimes it's not race. It's sort of it is race, and it's these sort of ideas like individualism and meritocracy and sort of objectivity, as if we could be sort of objectively not see race. It's all these things, all these belief systems that are from the Enlightenment handed down through white patriarchal, that the result is institutionalized racism for people who don't consciously hold it. I think that's been really helpful talking to people. It's hey, you may not feel Black people are worth less, but you still believe in individualism and that everyone gets a fair shot in the United States, which is inherently not true and racist.
Right. Yeah. It's inherently racist because it's historically racist. That whole idea of individualism and bootstraps and if you work hard, you can make it. It has been legislated to be possible for white people since the beginning of the country, and legislated to be impossible for Black people who are enslaved, Indigenous people who are either killed and then enslaved, or often, if not killed, enslaved, Mexicans who are on their own land and then suddenly they're immigrants and suddenly getting deported. It's Mexican. The immigration history with Mexico is very complicated. I think one of the things that white folks can do actually, and that is important to do, is take a look at their own histories and their own family histories and just chart out the political happenings of the same time. Pick a year, the year your parents got married or bought their first house, or the year somebody went to college, and take a look at what Congress did in that year that might have helped your family. You could probably Google it, bought a house in 1952, what was the legislation? And you'd get the GI Bill and get all sorts of things. So I think, and this is something that someone like you can do, Ryan, who's already really thought this through, is think about ways to tell your own story that reveals those arrangements, those human decisions that made it possible for your family to work as hard as they did, to pass something on to the next generation, to get an education, to get a platform, to get a break on a job. That stuff is so invisible to you when it is legislated for you, and particularly in a country where people don't know a lot about how things get done. How does the trash get picked up off the streets? And what is Social Security? I think that's very powerful storytelling from white folks. And you don't have to talk about Black people or Native Americans about whom you may know nothing. You can just talk about your own set of folks and what they benefited from that others couldn't. I think that's a narrative line that all white folks are equipped for. There's nothing standing in your way to develop that. And that would make a big, big difference in our racial discourse.
Yeah, I wrote an article 2 months ago called Let's Talk About White Supremacy. And I sort of charted how the GI Bill had benefited both sides of my family, which I don't think many white people understand, what happened with the GI Bill, how racist it was.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I wanted to get, have you read the Winners Take All book, Anand Giridharadas?
I haven't read all of it yet, but I've read several long reviews, and I'm looking forward to reading it.
Yeah. I'm kind of curious. I listened to an interview with him, and he was talking about this idea of the mega trend, and where he's Trump has been, has made a lot of progressives feel like we're the resistance. but it's actually like Trump and the white nationalists are the resistance to like the trend, the mega trend. And it's like over the next 50 to 100 years, like, you know, people of color and women, it's just like who's being born and who's dying is not who the country is currently comprised of. And it was interesting around like, he's like, this mega trend, we have to be careful about sort of circling the wagons around like the woke. And like, because he's sort of like, I feel like there's a lot of people in the middle who are like white, and they're maybe not like progressive, but they're sort of like, they could go either way. Like they could go white nationalist to Trump, or they could be. And so I'm curious, like, do you have what is your thoughts on like do you engage with people who are not quite there? Or is it like, how do you really deal with the folks who are like, who maybe don't really agree with full like dismantling white supremacy, but are not like supportive of Trump, but are just sort of like in the middle that could go either way? Like, how do we deal with that segment of people? I'm not curious.
I do engage them. And I think, so my thoughts about the mega trend is that the numbers don't lie. So the demographics are going to change. Trump's policies are a bit of a desperate attempt to stop it, but I don't see how that's going to work. Like, even if not another immigrant of color entered this country in the next 25 years, it's still going to shift. So, however, there are people who think that because the demographics are going to change, that, you know, kind of multiracial pluralistic democracy will just kind of evolve, because we will be in relationship with each other and we'll fall in love, and a lot of us will get married and we'll have babies, or maybe we'll have babies, we won't get married. And do you remember that National Geographic cover from a few years ago? It said, "This is the American of the future." And it was this kind of ambiguously multiracial looking person with curly hair and green eyes. And, you know, they were trying to say, like, we're all going to mix up, and this is what the American is going to look like of 2060 or whatever. And my position is that I don't think we can copulate our way to a multiracial pluralistic democracy. Like, just relying on people to fall in love and have sex and have babies, that's not a strategy. So what my biggest fear is that all the demographics will change, but the politics won't, and the institutions won't. And so what you'll get is a white minority ruling a majority of color, or you'll get a white and Asian near majority, because if those two groups got together, and economically they wield a lot of power, and politically, increasingly politically conservative Asians wield a lot of power as well, then that would be a block that would cut a lot of people of color out of. So I think that the only way to get to that multiracial vision of our country is to organize around it. And everybody has to be organized around it, including the white folks. And not just in a, like, hey, Thai food on the corner is okay, you're going to like that, you're going to enjoy that. But in a way that speaks to their self-interest, you know, I think, as well as to their moral interests. So we've all got them. We've all got moral interests and moral positions, and we all also have to live. And we're making decisions all the time about how we're going to reconcile our morality with our need to live. And those are the questions that, if there is a new demographic majority or a new political majority, those are the questions we have to grapple with and answer. And we have to answer them for everybody. We can't answer them just for immigrants. We can't answer them just for the white working class. But neither can we ignore immigrants or ignore the white working class. And I know it's hard. Our organizations are really resource poor. You know, if you carve out a constituency, it's everything you can do to just be able to keep doing what that constituency needs. It's very difficult to find the time to to like be in common cause with another constituency, or even to think about their strategy. But that's the only way I think we're going to have a movement powerful enough to fight for a truly new set of politics and new economic arrangements. You know, I support the fight for. I support worker organizing, no matter where it's happening, but like at some point we're not going to have these workplaces. Like some point not that far from now, you know, everything's going to be automated. So what can we
thought you meant,
build?
since we're speaking to each other from home, that we're like,
oh yeah, that too. Yeah, I was more thinking that when you drive through McDonald's, there won't be a human being there handing you anything. It's all going to be machines, but you'll be able to get your burger, you know. And that is not that's not a totally distant future thing. That's coming pretty soon. So I think, I think
that's
I can
great.
stop talking.
Yeah. No, that's perfect. You know, what are some of the things that you're most excited about? You know, we've talked about a lot of different areas. Is there anything that's like particularly juicing you right now about like, oh, I'm so excited about this or this potential movement, or what's kind of giving you energy?
Yeah, I mean, I am really excited that many of the organizations and individual leaders that I wrote about in Stir It Up, which was a little bit of a survey of women, feminist economic justice organizing around the country, that so many of those people and institutions have matured and are really doing just amazing things. We were talking about the Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, which The Accidental American, my second book, is their origin story. And I wrote it in collaboration with their co-founder, Fekak Mamdou, a Moroccan immigrant who worked in restaurants his whole time in the United States and then became an organizer after September 11th. So they have really organized enough restaurant workers and changed the discussion about the economy enough that they're a force that restaurant owners have to contend with. The National Restaurant Association has to respond to what Rock United says should happen. And for the past few years, they've been fighting to get rid of the federal tipped minimum wage. So tipped workers, their minimum wage has been stuck at $2, I believe it's 10 or 15 cents an hour for like 30 years, for decades. And there shouldn't be a tipped minimum wage. There shouldn't be tips. Tipping, as Rock has shown through their research, tipping is a holdover from the days of slavery and Reconstruction and Southern whites wanting to control the behavior of Black people who are now getting a wage, you know, instead of being enslaved. So they've been making steady progress on their fight to get rid of tipping and the tipped minimum wage, working through particular cities that have gotten rid of tipping. Seattle, I believe, did that, proving that replacing tips with better wages is better both for the restaurants and for the workers in them, and fighting off the NRA, the Employers Association, and all their fear-mongering about how, you know, the entire industry is going to fall apart if we end tipping. It's not. So I love that work. I'm always inspired by domestic workers organizing. I think they're just amazing. This organizing of workers who are really spread around, not in traditional workplaces, I think that is the future of labor organizing. We just talked about how our workplaces are disappearing or being automated. Service work can never be fully automated. Like, no machine is really going to be able to change someone's diaper or feed them. And so that kind of organizing, I think, is going to be the clue for how we're going to have to do all worker organizing in the future, because traditional workplaces are going to change. So those are exciting. I am about to start spending a lot of my time in Texas. So I'm very excited about Texas politics. I'm very excited about the organization JOLT and their founder, Cristina Sinsun Ramirez, who also started the Workers' Defense Project in Austin. They are the people who won some of the state's very first worker protections in the construction industry, like water breaks. Can you imagine being a construction worker in Texas and not getting water breaks in the summer and needing to have that legislated? So they did. So Christina has a long and wonderful history, and she's now organizing young Latinos in Texas to assert their politics. And so I'm excited about helping change the state of Texas.
Hey, any upcoming books at all for you, or are you sort of?
I'm pondering a couple. Yeah, thinking about a couple. I've been thinking a lot about why I got into racial justice work in the first place, and how deeply I resent having an identity slapped on me because of this accident of the way I look. Whether privilege, some of that identity has privilege and some of it is more disadvantaged, but I just resent that so much. And I resent it on behalf of other people. But over the years, working, it's a 35-year career now, your focus ends up being on details of legislation. Is affirmative action good or bad? Is welfare good or bad? How do we prove that it's good? How do we prove it's good for everybody? And all that negotiation and organizational planning has, it's just been a long time since I spent a lot of time thinking about how the essence of a human being is not racial. And so I have been thinking about going back to the beginning, my college years, in particular the 84-85 academic year where I started organizing and where we won all sorts of good racial things, but also a whole bunch of good gender things, feminist things, and writing a narrative history of identity-based campus organizing in the 80s, where I think a lot of us who got involved did because we didn't want gender or race to determine our own or anybody else's life course. And that's an idea that I think could use a bit of lifting up, and that we could all remind ourselves of, even while we're being vilified by the right wing as identity politics practitioners. Apparently the new right wing word for us is identitarians, which made me think, I thought only the left loved big words. Like, that is a gigantic word. And I thought it was only the left that liked to produce big esoteric
Sean
words.
Hannity one or something.
I don't know who came up with it first, but it's what the right wing tweets out about us. The horrible things identitarians do. But most of us who are of a certain age, not boomers and not millennials, we started out wanting human beings not to be bound by stupid stuff. And I'd love to spend some time thinking about how that worked out in my own life, how that played out in my own life.
I love it. I'm sure Barrett Kohler is excited for whatever you propose to them.
Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe in the last one or two questions here, we often ask guests, what do they need right now? And if the listeners can do anything to help you grow this next economy.
What do I need right now? Well, so one of the things I've been thinking about is all this stuff around civility and listening and arguments. So people who, there's kind of a line that we're very polarized as a country now, more divided than we've ever been. We can't even be civil to each other. People's marriages and stuff are breaking up over Trump. And I've been really thinking about that so hard because as Tayari Jones wrote in the New York Times, you can't be civil about immorality. Like immoral action, you just have to like call it immoral. You can't be polite about it, and it doesn't require kindness. So I agree with that 100%. And I also worry that over many years of advocacy and activism and communicating, that my listening skills are like not good, that I decide very quickly who I'm going to listen to and who I'm not. And I wonder if sometimes I decide the wrong way. And I wonder if I'm missing something. When I decide the wrong way, am I missing some key piece of understanding that I need in order to do my work, which is to make racial justice? I'll give you a very quick example. I was doing a training a couple of years ago, and it was a very hostile room of people who did not want to hear it, and of mostly law enforcement people. And during the fighting period, one of the men in the room said, "I do not believe that there is systemic racial bias in law enforcement. I do not believe it exists." And
he doesn't know where the police started, maybe.
I'm pretty sure that's true. I'm pretty sure he doesn't know that. So I kept doing my training, and I don't know, we did things. But what I really wish I had done in that moment is asked him, what does systemic racial bias mean to you? When you hear that exists, what images come to your mind? And why do you insist that it doesn't exist in law enforcement? I needed to know that in order to keep doing my work. And I can't assume that I do know it. I can't assume that he says it because he doesn't care if it's there, or that he himself is a Klan member, or I really can't assume anything on the basis of that one sentence, or even the morning of interaction we had. I needed to ask him some questions. And so if your listeners have any tips for me or any experiences they want to share about listening in hard circumstances, I would really love to see those.
Oh, that's such a beautiful request. That's awesome. And then how can folks learn more about your work and get in touch with you if they do have the thoughts?
The best thing to do is to sign up at rinkusen.com. And if they just go to the site, they'll find a button to sign in. And the great thing about my site is that once you're signed on, you can have access to everything I put up, and you can comment and stuff. But you can also start conversations yourself. You can post an article that you're reading. You can post something that you yourself have written. You can post a reflection. It works very similarly to Facebook, and I will respond. So the best way to keep track of what I'm up to is on that site. And the most consistency you'll get is if you sign up.
I love that. I'm just going to make some bad jokes about Facebook too, like tracking your data. Rinku's not doing that.
I don't track your data. Nope, I will never share your data. No Russians will ever see your data. And really not even any other Americans will see your data.
Well, thank you so much for joining, Rinku. It's been a pleasure. And I hope to maybe have you back again soon. Love to hear, as this sort of evolves. I'd love to keep in touch.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
That concludes this episode of Next Economy Now, and now on to our mini interview with Doug Bistry, CEO of Clearinghouse CDFI.
Okay, welcome, Doug, to this interview series, the Next Economy Now podcast. And for listeners, I think one of the reasons I'm excited about Clearinghouse CDFI is that you're a lot different than other financial institutions. So could you speak a little bit about this idea of growth? There's a lot of folks who feel that we need to grow to have a big impact on the world. But at the same time, sometimes companies grow too quickly, and then the impact gets watered down because they are actually losing their original intention. And can you speak about this balance and how you've thought about it at Clearinghouse?
Yeah. it's a really interesting topic. And I remember harken back to one of the OFN conferences years and years ago when I was still relatively new to the industry. And the director of OFN at the time, Mark Pinsky, gave a speech to all CDFIs entitled Grow, Change, or Die. And it was met with a good amount of resistance. I've always felt that, growing for the sake of growing is not what it's all about. I'm the kind of person that finds it kind of fun to grow and to continue to build. But for us, it's about being able to do more in the community. There was a time where our loan limit was $250,000. And, we thought that was a lot and we could help a lot of groups. Now we've done, we're looking at a $30 million loan right now. And just the sheer volume, the dollar amount, the difference you can make when you're at a size that we're at or another large CDFI is really just remarkable. And, as president CEO now, sometimes I'm a little bit removed from the projects, but, you go out to a grand opening or groundbreaking ceremony and you really realize what our dollars is doing and the lives that it's changing. So to me, growth is about impact. And again, I enjoy watching our company grow. It's inspiring to me. It's something that motivates me. But if it didn't come with an increase in our impact, an increase in helping low and moderate income communities or communities of color, it wouldn't have any meaning to me.
What is your long-term vision for Clearinghouse? Like, let's say, 5, 10, 20 years down the road, what's the vision of success that you're looking to create?
Yeah, well, right now we are undertaking I'll call it a recapitalization of the company. And what we're really trying to do is keep up with our growth. And we need to raise additional equity capital to keep up with our lending. And quite frankly, our lending has exceeded a volume that I could have ever imagined when I started this company 22 years ago. And I think we are looking at some strategic geographic areas of expansion. And again, we went into Nevada in the middle of the financial crisis when all of the community banks were failing there. And I remember people on our board telling me that we were nuts. It was like, why would you go into Nevada now? They're bulldozing down subdivisions. This is the worst time. And once again, that is, as a CDFI, we want to run to the fire. We want to go where there's the most need. And the fact that the banks there were shutting down and there was no, really community bank presence meant that it was important for us to be there. And so we are continuing to grow. I think that it's not unrealistic to see us as a $1 billion plus CDFI. And I kind of pinch myself when I say that because it doesn't even sound right. But, Ryan, we're on that growth pattern right now. And if we're successful with this recapitalization, we'll have the equity to continue to grow and to continue to make important, impactful loans in the community.
And where can folks learn more about Clearinghouse and, say if there's any investors who are interested, what's the best way for them to get in contact?
We have a great website that has a ton of information, including our financials. It is www.ccdfi.com. Again, that's ccdfi.com. And a lot of information there. There's contact numbers. I'd be happy to talk to anybody that is serious about investing or working with us. And also, we're looking for projects to lend. Good projects. And so in our service areas, California, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and all of Indian country throughout the United States. So if anyone is aware of an unmet credit need that has good community impact, or, often our loans are made to entrepreneurs, people of color or members of groups that have been disenfranchised. And if anyone is aware of loans, boy, we'd love to hear from them as well.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. Lift is an impact consulting firm whose mission is to create, model, and share a locally self-reliant economy that works for the benefit of all life. To listen to all our past episodes or to share your thoughts about the show with us, visit www.lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also subscribe to this podcast through iTunes, Overcast, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please take a moment to rate us on iTunes. It's really very helpful in allowing these ideas to reach a wider audience. Once again, thanks for listening.